The problem with transparency is there is no privacy. So that is actually centralized just by default. It has to be. They keep saying digital sovereignty, which it sounds like an oxymoron to me. I know there are people who are really working on truly private technologies. I hope they will accomplish that. But some of those kind of technologies have been hacked already. So it's a real problem.
Welcome to Collapse Life. I'm Zahra Sethna, your host. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel for more bold conversations about our changing world. If you ask people if the government needs a reboot, most would probably say yes, or at least admit there's something deeply broken. The real question isn't if change is coming, it's what kind of change and who's behind it. Right now, there are some converging movements actively trying to answer that question. They go by strange names like Dark Enlightenment, Game B, Network State, and Theobros. Today's guest is Courtenay Turner, a fellow podcaster and a deep thinker who has spent years mapping how belief systems, spiritual archetypes, and psychological frameworks are driving these movements forward and even sometimes weaponizing them. She recently wrote an incredible article called The Phoenix Conspiracy, and she's here today to help us understand the key players, where they overlap, and what kind of world they're trying to build. Courtenay, welcome to Collapse Life.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you. As I mentioned, you wrote this article, which is really an incredible deep dive, and I'm really looking forward to spending some time kind of breaking it down into its component parts. But maybe before we go there, just tell us a little bit about what first drew you to start connecting these dots between movements that are actively trying to replace liberal democracy.
So I've been kind of tracking these movements for a while now. I guess, maybe a few years. And I had been diving into Game B. So I'll tell you how I found Game B. I had seen, and I was actually supposed to be at this event. Now, in hindsight, it's probably for the best that I wasn't. But it was the Rescue the Republic event.
Right.
And I watched Brett Weinstein's presentation. And at the end of it, the last 5 minutes, he parrots the very famous, aphorism where Ben Franklin says, he was asked, what kind of a republic is that? What kind of a government is this, sir? And he says, it's a republic if you can keep it. Mm-hmm. And he says, well, it's a republic if you can phoenix it.
What we must deliver is a republic if we can phoenix it.
And I got chills, and I was kind of like, whoa, what do you mean by that? That's bizarre. And it wasn't a throwaway. Firstly, that whole speech, he kept addressing the West, which is very odd because certainly the United States is a byproduct of Western civilization, and they're absolutely trying to deracinate us from those roots, which, that's not good at all, and that needs to be restored. However, we are not the West. We are the constitutional republic. And the theme was rescue the republic, which would imply that this was specifically targeting, rescuing the United States of America, not the West. But he kept addressing the West, which I also found very odd. Mm-hmm. And then he spends 5 minutes at the end of this speech talking about how we have to phoenix the republic. And he uses this whole analogy from, evolutionary biology, which is his background. And he says, we don't have this genetic, lineage that carries on for survival through, our Western values, and then it's being destroyed. And he makes this parallel, but it was just very bizarre to me. So I started doing a little investigating. What could he mean by this? And I was very familiar with the phoenix concept, the semiotics of the phoenix bird. It's funny, my grandfather actually started a company, and he named it Phoenix Beverages. So, I grew up with you, and he didn't know the implications of it at all. He just liked the idea of, like, he felt like they were always failing, and the companies kept falling into the ground, and he was trying to rebirth this vision. So that's kind of the colloquial interpretation, and that's the euphemistic kind of version of it. However, as I outlined in my article, there's a lot of esoteric meaning to the phoenix bird. And, we kept hearing through Biden administration how we have to build back better. But what does that imply? It implies we probably have to tear it down first, right?
Everything needs to be destroyed in order to build something back.
And the phoenix has to burn, right? You burn rises out of the ashes. So it's really the story of it's alchemical. It's really like a hermetic principle of this. You have to destroy something, and out of that, there's this rebirth. And it is also dialectical in nature, right? That's the Aufheben nature of dialectical synthesis, which, for those who aren't familiar with the term, that's a German term. Usually, dialectics refers to Hegelian dialectics. It didn't originate with Hegel, but certainly I think he popularized the notion and codified it. And Aufheben is a very oxymoronic term in German that means to cancel and tear down while simultaneously lifting up and preserving. So the more familiar reference might be Aufheben die Kultur, which the Frankfurt School codified. They'd never actually used that term, but that's essentially what they their MO was like this, and it means cancel culture, but it's just to cancel, right? Because it's a hollowing out. So you have the shell of the thing, and then the Aufheben is how you move up the rungs. It's a spiral in Hegelian reference. And I'm in the process of writing a book on Hegelian dialectics, and you can find the sneak preview of it on my Substack. It's called Hegel's Dialectic, a Gnostic Jacob's Ladder and a Machinery of Control. And that thesis is that it is a Gnostic Jacob's Ladder. And Aufheben is how you move up the rungs towards the pleroma, pleroma, sorry. So that's kind of this Phoenix reference of, we have to burn it down. And I was very familiar with it because I've done so much research on Tavistock, and Tavistock was one of the first references where I saw this Operation Phoenix. Of course, I'm familiar with the CIA Operation Phoenix, which was also, right, we have to burn down communism to preserve the West, right? That was messaging. We burned the village to build the village. And that was the justification for all of the, terrorism and the brainwashing and the atrocities in Vietnam, the Viet Cong in that time. But before that, prior to that, there was Operation Phoenix, and it was Tavistock's Operation Phoenix. And there have been other references, obviously, to the Phoenix going all the way back to the ancients, even, the ancient Egyptians, the Bendix bird. And I outline all of those in, I don't know that I caught them all, but I outlined several of the ancient references to the mystical references of the Phoenix. But Operation Phoenix was during World War II. So out of the ashes of World War II, if you will, there was this restructuring. And in 1946, the Tavistock Clinic. So the Tavistock Clinic works with the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, but they are separate functionalities, separate purposes. And the clinic is much more focused on personal therapy. So sometimes group therapy, but, definitely individual personal therapy. And the Institute is much more focused on research, corporate kind of culture, types of much more mass scale type of psychological research. I would argue operations, but that's up for interpretation. But I definitely think there's plenty of evidence to substantiate that claim. But they had this injection of investment from the Rockefeller Foundation, which enabled them to open up the Institute in 1947. So in 1946, they were doing all of this restructuring to open up the Institute, and it came out of Wilfred Byron's War Office Selection Boards, which was a whole process of how to select military leaders in World War II, working with the British military. And they used this in order to essentially create change agents through the Institute. And it was this idea of you have to, gut everything and, tear it down, just start over in order to restructure and build anew. And it was Eric Trist and Wilfred Byron. Wilfred Byron had this whole concept of leaderless groups, which ties into this. It's very relevant, actually. Leaderless groups, he had this theory that there were two types of groups. One was like the working group, which was a much healthier, in my opinion, type of group. It would be as if, you and I and some other people got together and we're going to collaborate, work on a project. All of our strengths and talents are still going to be reflected in this product, whatever we're creating together. And we don't lose our individuality in that, but then there's the basic assumption groups. And that's essentially where you become a hive. And they all start to meld And so there becomes kind of like a unilarity of thought, right? Uniform thought across. So that's the basic assumption group. And this is his theory of like how we can have these leaderless groups. And this led to this restructuring, this Operation Phoenix. So I was familiar with this reference, but so I started looking into where else is this Phoenix? And, you know, of course, I thought about the Great Reset and I outlined that as well. But in diving into a little bit of Brett Weinstein, I stumbled across this Game B, and I was shocked that I'd never heard of it because it's not covert at all. It's actually right on his Twitter handle. It says Game B. And so, you know, it's actually been discussed quite a bit. He talked about it on Rogan. I just wasn't familiar at all. And it goes all the way back to 2011. So Game B, for those who aren't familiar with it, is this, it was born out of these Stanton meetings. So the Stanton meetings were an attempt to create a political party, a political movement. We call it the Emancipation Party. And it's actually, in the article I'm working on right now, I very clearly outline this, but there is a document from Andrew Cohen on Manifest Nirvana, where I had always had this theory, but I didn't have any.
Andrew Cohen?
So he's an integralist. So Ken Wilber, who's also like a Game B adjacent. I would say he's a Game B thought leader, and a lot of Game B is predicated on his theory of integralism. Okay. He has this theory of integralism. He has this book on creating the one world religion. Then the religion of tomorrow is essentially one world religion. It's very integrated. It's synchronistic, syncretic. And synchronistic. And his theory, he also has his theory of altitudes, which is predicated on Clare Graves' spiral dynamics. And also Abraham Maslow's like hierarchy of needs. Abraham Maslow, would be a whole tangent, but I'll just very quickly mention Abraham Maslow, positive psychology, humanist psychology, but he posthumously published something called Politics 3. Which is very interesting because at Politics 3, he was working on it, but he passed before he published it. His wife, Bertha, actually brought it to Robert Cantor and Willis Harman. And it was right around the same time that Willis Harman was working on The Changing Images of Man document at Stanford Research Institute. Changing Images of Man, there were many people involved in this, like Joseph Campbell. There was W.O. Markley, who was working on all that remote viewing studies, right? So Changing Images of Man, the whole concept behind that was essentially that we were going to move out of the age of Pisces, which is focused on the individual and very competitive, into the age of Aquarius, which would be very collaborative, the collective, right? It's the water, the flow. And Willis Harman was the chairman of the Institute for Noetic Sciences, IONS, for actually 2 decades. And so it was just very interesting to me that right around that same time that they were working on this Changing Images of Man study, which is all about changing the consciousness of man, man's perception of himself. Bertha Maslow brings this document for him to publish. And most people think about Maslow, they think about the hierarchy of needs, but that really wasn't his primary interest at all. And he actually never made a pyramid. That was just kind of a textbook sales pitch. I guess it was a way to codify it, easier to remember and more punchy. But he actually never referenced that. It would have been more Scott Barry Kaufman is kind of an indirect disciple of Maslow through like Jonathan Haidt and some of these other positive psychologists. And he references it as sailboat. And I actually think that's a much more accurate visual. However, the whole purpose of this hierarchy of needs was to get us to being values. And that was, so he called them B values, but it was for being. And really what his premise was that people who had already achieved this hierarchy of needs could focus on things that were really important, like religion and politics and art and, things that influence society and culture. And in this document on Politics 3, he talks about holistic politics, which is, of course, this integration of everything. And it was this predicated on his notion of the Psychian network, which is very influential on Barbara Marx Hubbard, who was kind of like a mentor to a lot of these Game B thought leaders. And Barbara Marx Hubbard was so excited when she met Abraham Maslow. She talks about how psyche and networking was this, change her life, and it's better than sex. It was super sex, is what she calls it. So she had this whole concept of which Mark Gaffney now talks about, the radical love affair with the universe. So that's this notion of super sex.
Wow.
But this psyche network where people, it's essentially the same over and over again, this theme of spiritual eugenics. These people who had ascended, these people who had met all of those, their hierarchy of needs, and they could now focus on things because they were spiritually evolved, like politics, religion, culture, art, and so forth. And so this psyche network of people would then be involved in the holistic politics, which I think really influenced the UN through Robert Mueller. He talks about, if you read his 2,000 ideas that I think became 4,000, who knows, it might have become 20,000. He fancied himself quite the visionary, but I think it ended up being 4,000. It was supposed to be 2. And he keeps talking about planetics, which is planetary politics.
Mm-hmm.
This concept of holistic politics all ties together, because I see game B very much as the technological age of Aquaria. So they're talking about how we have to move into collective intelligence. They use terms like anti-rivalrous, omni-win. They say that we're in game A right now, which is too exploitative, too competitive, too extractive. We need to move into game B, which is anti-rivalrous, omni-win, collective intelligence. They have a lot of words, all the sense,
Right.
their own language, essentially. So this was born out of, it was Jordan Hall had gone to an event at the Perimeter Institute where Eric Weinstein was speaking. Sorry, I was mispronouncing the name. Eric Weinstein was speaking, and it was right after the financial crisis, 2008.
Mm-hmm.
And in that, he actually talks about Plan A, Plan B, but he doesn't mention Game A, Game B, and it was referencing economic paradigms. But at that meeting, Jordan met Brett and Eric kept talking about how he has to get together with his brother and they have to collaborate. So Jordan calls him the rabbi of Game B. And it really, Jordan said they really didn't hit it off. And, these concepts really didn't start brewing until Jordan Hall was working at the Santa Fe Institute, and so was Jim Rutt. Jim Rutt was actually brought in. He was the chairman of the Santa Fe Institute, and he was brought in because he was working on evolutionary software. And
what is that?
So it's predicated on this idea of, evolution, and that we could use some sort of a software program. I don't know exactly how it worked, to be really honest. But my guess is that they were going to use, we'll get to this. So Brett Weinstein had posed a question. I'm in the middle of an article, which I think by the time this is out, it will be out. But he had posed a question at the Edge Foundation, which is, one of Epstein's projects. Brockman was the literary agent who kind of ran it. I think he was the CEO. But Epstein was one of the primary funders. They used to have these annual dinners. They called it the Billionaires Dinner. And they did this thing called the annual question. So it was like a bunch of scientists would present what is the final question, the last question. And in 2018, both Eric and Brett Weinstein had posed their question. And Brett's question was, can humans set a non-evolutionary course for humanity? And that to me very much indicates Eric's question was kind of related. He said, will something unprecedented happen when humans can unveil their own source code?
Wow.
And I think that's kind of ties to this evolutionary software. I don't know enough about it, but I think this idea of using software, AI, complexity theory, systems theory to evolve is my guess. But I don't quote me on that. I'd have to do more digging on it.
Enough. But, the idea is, it sounds like from the question, even to evolve beyond evolving, to get to some state where everything is just shimmering and there's no need to continue to go through iteration after iteration. We just reach some sort of almost nirvana.
Yes. So so, obviously this is predicated on the notion that you subscribe to evolutionary biology, right? I actually don't. So, and there's mixed views on that, but he's an evolutionary biologist. So he subscribes to the theory of evolution, Darwinian theory of evolution. A lot of these people incorporate social Darwinian theory as well. But he's certainly he believes in theory of evolution. But so he believes in theory of evolution, but he's implying that there might be a way that humans could chart a path, a trajectory that is not predicated on evolution. What would that mean? That would mean some sort of a transhuman, a technological, something that is out of the realm of human nature, right? Not human natural adaptation. That's what it implies to me, and that's very much in line with a lot of what the Edge Foundation, scientists were working on developing and discussing. So with this evolutionary software, I haven't been able to find a whole lot of information on it, but I will do more digging to find it. That's my conjecture based on everything I know about these people, is where it's going. So he was at the Santa Fe Institute, so was Jordan Hall. They got together, and then Jim started doing these meetings. He called them the Stanton meetings. And the thing that I find very interesting about this, why I brought up Andrew Cohen, Manifest Nirvana, and I'll have the receipts in this article that's coming out. But I had suspected that the intellectual dark web, which Eric Weinstein coined, right? He coined that term, and certainly Brett was involved as well, was an influence operation for Game B. And in the article on Manifest Nirvana, it's a white paper for Manifest Nirvana. Andrew Cohen pretty much says that he doesn't use the term influence operation. That's kind of heavy-handed. That's my term. But he pretty much says that it seeded the groundwork for the public's acquiescence to the concepts that emerged from Game B, and that, the intellectual dark web laid the foundation for that to occur. But back in 2011, Jim Rutt was doing these meetings, the Stanton meetings, Stanton, Virginia, and he invited a bunch of evolutionary biologists like Brett Weinstein. And of course, Jordan Hall was there to try and launch a new political platform. And this was called the Emancipation Party. And it was very much like a Bernie Sanders platform. They wanted universal healthcare. They wanted a variation of the UBI, universal basic income. So a lot of these types of initiatives. And he said that he got a lot of support from the boomers. They were all on board. And, they were really all in. But he said the Gen X, he felt like he could probably persuade them. I'm paraphrasing, but essentially what he's saying. He could persuade them. But he said the millennials were it was an anathema to them because they were such anarchists that the idea of a political party was just an anathema. And he said, well, we got to toss this because we can't really do a political movement without the millennials. And so it was Thor Mueller who told him they had been throwing out this idea of Game B, which was a new operating system for civilization. And he said, you should keep the name for branding purposes. So they kept the name. And Jim Rutt talks about how there was kind of a schism around 2013 because he felt some of the Game Bers were a little bit too woo-woo. That was kind of his way of explaining it. And this is the Daniel Schmachtenberger, the Zach Stein, like the people who are the disciples of Barbara Marx Hubbard. And so I think that's who he was referencing. And then he said he was a hard scientist. I think we could debate whether or not complexity theory is hard science, but, that's how he sees himself. It's certainly of the more mechanistic, which is, again, now we're going back to, it's this old schism between the rational, right, and the mystical. And I think kind of look at the dark Enlightenment versus Game B that way as well. Of course, they both end up at the same place. They end up in technocracy. So the way I explain it in the article is because a lot of these occult groups and ancient mystery religions operate through left-hand and right-hand paths. And so when you think about the political spectrum, regardless of whether or not you subscribe to it being a spectrum that way, I know a lot of people think of it as it's really just a uniparty, but they do operate through right-hand paths.
Yes.
And certainly the right-hand path, which is what, we're ostensibly under a Republican president, Republican, politicians, right? Right now they have three branches. So you could see it as the right-hand path, which tends to be more patriarchal, right? The kind of authoritarian, disciplinarian, more muscular, traditional type of archetypes. And then the left-hand path would be like the Divine Mother, more kind of nurturing, soft power influence, and theosophical, spiritual. And that's very much left. That's very much the game B versus the Dark Enlightenment.
Right.
So,
and these are theories that draw different people along, but essentially funnel them into the same place, as you just described, which is, the post-democratic future, which is shaped by technocratic ideas, governed by algorithms, by experts, by things like smart contracts and digital tokens, and so really, it's a different formula to get you to the same answer.
It's just kind of like if you had a fork in the road and one is a tree line with palm trees and the other one is more mountainous with like rock, ridges. And it's like, which path do you want to take? But they both end up at the same place.
Right. And then there are, as you described in your article, a couple of other movements or mechanisms that are also drawing into the same final destination: network state, Theobros. I mean, there's a million others, but these are a couple of the ones that you really articulated in that article. Theobros seems like a natural place to go next, since you already talked about the Dark Enlightenment. So maybe you can kind of tie those two together. And those are some of the people who are actually governing at the very moment.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So the Theobros are, they tend to be a group that are, they subscribe to what's called Christian nationalism. And this is not my label. They call themselves Christian nationalists. I know I've gotten some pushback. People think that, you're somehow attacking Christians who are patriotic. That's not true at all. I do think there's a difference between patriotism and nationalism. And that's a distinction a lot of people don't make. That is an important distinction, in my opinion. But however, I'm actually not concerned with people who are, support their nation and hold fast to their Christian theology. That is not my concern at all. My concern is the specific group of people who label themselves Christian nationalists, and they are talking about replacing the Constitution with biblical law. Now, I think the Ten Commandments are wonderful. I think that, people who, use them as their moral code, a guide, that's great. Certainly inculcate those values in your children if that's something that's important to you. But it is fundamentally, diametrically opposed to the First Amendment of the Constitution, which says that we have freedom of religion. So to replace our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, and our entire governing structure with a Christian framework is antithetical to everything this country stands for. Mm-hmm. So that is my concern. And they're kind of, in my opinion, I don't think they're very Christian at all. I think they're using what I call Christianese. They're using Christian language, a Christian veneer, which makes sense that you would operate through the right-hand path, which typically is more traditional. A lot of them are more religious. And, that's great. I have no problems with any of that. My problem is when you're operating through that using, there's nothing in the Bible that says to force your beliefs on anybody else. Mm-hmm. So not only is it antithetical to the very First Amendment of the Constitution, but I think it's actually fundamentally opposed to what Christianity actually is. Mm-hmm. But they are using this Christian veneer. And I think that the thing that's so potentially pernicious about this is that, and so what makes it so successful operationally, is that it gives the divine mandate to the things that, the Dark Enlightenment and Game B can't do. So, now you're forcing these policies, these ideas onto people, but you're claiming that it's sacrosanct. You have a divine justification for doing so. And that's kind of what you're seeing, but it's through this attachment to, tradition, to religion, and through the umbrella of Christianity. And they're not all related. There's like the NAR movement, which is, Paula White, who's in the Trump administration advising Trump. There's, of course, Pete Hegseth is a member of this CRE church. And of course, J.D. Vance, he's been attending some of these church that are affiliated with these Christian nationalist ideas. So, and then there's the Gundo Bros, which I outlined in my article, and they're kind of tying it to defense military technology. So,
another spoke in this wheel, so to speak, is network states. So talk a little bit about that. And then I want to get to kind of how these overlap with each other.
Sure. So the network state is a concept from Balaji Srinivasan, and it was inspired by Peter Thiel's seasteading concept. So Peter Thiel had this idea. It's actually very reminiscent of Ghislaine Maxwell's Terramar, if you're familiar with that. But it's this idea that you would have these city-states on international waters. Mm-hmm. So, of course, that means they're outside of the jurisdiction of sovereign nations, of the laws of sovereign nations. And he put about $1.7 million, the number that I saw, into this concept, but it didn't really take off. But it very much inspired Balaji Srinivasan, who wrote this book called Network States, and he actually has a chapter dedicated to seasteading. And he talks about how we can revive seasteading. He thinks that, once we get these network state concepts off and running, that, we could just crowdfund for a yacht and a cruise ship, and then it'll be no problem to have seasteading. But this idea of network states is to have a dissolution of geographical nation states in favor of ideological cyber network states. And so you'll essentially have these little city states, and you may have some physiological grounding, like Prospera would be an example of that, but you might not. It might really just be in the ether or the cloud, these networks that are connected through the internet. However, it's very much like a communitarian type of environment. You'd likely need a passport to enter. How are you going to get into this network state, right? Mm-hmm. You're going to likely have a currency, a digital currency of sort. There will be, of course, rules and policies and terms of service, if you will, mm-hmm. That will be enforced likely through a smart contract. And of course, he couches it as this is all voluntary. You can choose whatever network state you like. You can come and go as you please. But what people don't seem to recognize is that there is no negotiating with a smart contract, and especially a recursive smart contract. So once that code has been implemented and then it's recursively designed, it's just building upon itself. You're arguing with a machine mm-hmm. code, and good luck with that. So I don't know how easy it is going to be just to come and go as you please. And I also don't know how, copacetic it's going to be if you violate their conditions. Mm-hmm. So what if the analogy I use, and it's kind of silly, but just because everybody thinks their diet is the supreme. So let's say you've got a vegan network state and the carnivore network state, and you're in the vegan one and you happen to go to dinner with some people and have a steak. Like, I don't know. Are they going to be cool with that? Is that okay? Are you right. admitted? Are you going to have access to all of your other accoutrements in this network state now that you've violated their policies by eating meat? I know this is kind of like a silly example, but just to prove the point that this is how these things operate. And you've got a smart contract. And once you're in a lot of these, the way that the overlap through some of this is decentralized autonomous organizations, which are essentially network states, right? Mm-hmm. And Game B, Jordan Hall is a big proponent, and Game B actually has its own DAO, that's what they call it. A lot of these are running through technologies that are on your phone that can surveil you. And so we're putting a lot of trust in these supposedly libertarian, because it's under a libertarian auspices, which I philosophically have a lot of issues with libertarianism. I actually think it's a great conduit for technocratic implementation, because it's tied to self, like you as a self-governing entity, as opposed to as a being that has inalienable rights.
Mhm.
So it's really tied to property, which they can use as a vehicle, because property is all about contract, right? It's a contract law. So they can use that as a vehicle to usher you into their technocratic
Right.
control. And it's also I wrote an article on this if people want more of the philosophical background, is the Kantian roots of the libertarian movement. So it's very much rooted in nominalism, constructivism. It's not anchored in natural law. So that's again a whole tangent, but I did write an article if people want to dive deeper into that. But that aside, I don't even think any of this is actually authentic libertarianism. I think they're using it as a banner to lure more people in, people who might not be captured from the left or the right. They have this libertarian banner, which Peter Thiel claims to be, but he's not. I mean, none of his beliefs seem to be commensurate with either Christianity or libertarianism, which he seems to be. And his Prospera is a great example of how these network states operate. And this is his project in Honduras. His subsidiary, it was called Vitalia. And you can still find it on the Wayback Machine. I have the link in my article. And that's where it's a city where you can make death optional. They've now renamed it to Infinita. They're always renaming things, which is just, I think, just a telltale sign, right? Who else does that? The UN. They're always rebranding and renaming. So they have great marketing teams.
Right. I think one of the things that seems similar amongst all of these different pathways is that they're using these terms, these belief systems, as blunt instruments. So they're co-opting ideas like spiritualism or libertarianism or democracy or whatever, using whatever feels right to maybe the group of people that they're trying to speak to, although it doesn't sound much like they need public support to bring in what they're trying to do. One of the things that needs to be phoenixed, it sounds like, according to them, is the idea that people have any say in how these future utopias are built. We will construct them. You can live there if you want to and you qualify. And if you don't like it, you can leave. It's not like you can vote to change the way things are run. Is that right?
Well, I think Dark Enlightenment is much more autocratic. They're rolling it out as we speak. So Trump already put in his Genius Act. He signed it. They've already put the Stable Act and the Clarity Act to, I believe, to Congress is already reviewing that. So this is part of how they're going to. This is the conduit for tokenization. Once we get to tokenization, that's full blown technocracy. That's very, very concerning. So I think the Dark Enlightenment is they're top down. It's a hierarchical structure. They implement the Gov Corp, as Nick Land would call it, or the Sov Corp, as Curtis Yarvin calls it. He was so excited about Trump getting another term where he could just be a CEO and replace presidency and run it like a dictatorship. He says that Americans need to, in order to have a reboot, which he says that's what we need, a reboot of our government. He said in order for that to be accomplished, that Americans need to get over their fear of dictatorship. And so it's a much more, aggressive. Their whole concept is accelerationism, right?
Mhm.
This is Nick Land's theory of accelerationism, which he has this theory that capitalism is doomed to, implode. It's going to fail, where it's going to reach an apocalyptic state, but that we should help it along, move it as fast as possible, and we should use technology to do that. And so that's kind of how they operate. And I think game B is a little bit softer. They want us to opt into our own tyranny. So it's under the auspices that they will set up these infrastructures that, under the guise of quote unquote decentralization, they keep talking about how decentralized everything is. And I keep reminding them that H.G. Wells said that the decentralization of the academic institutions, the information institutions, so the media, academia, all of these various institutions would be the conduit to achieve the world brain. And that's a very reminiscent of what I'm seeing. Balaji Srinivasan talks about how all these network states are very decentralized, but it's towards a re-centralized center. So they will eventually be re-centralized. And when you talk about these technologies, Game B is advocating like Web3 type technologies, holochain, holonic kind of technologies, and they're all interoperable. So even more interoperable, actually, than what we have today, with the various platforms. Because various platforms are actually kind of siloed. You're on one platform, then you're on another platform, you're in your own little ecosystem. And a lot of times through the algorithms, it's an echo chamber. I wrote a pretty long piece, which I will be putting into book format. I'm going to publish it because so many people said they want to have a printed version of it. I didn't realize it's 120 pages in book format, but it's called The Algorithmic Oracle. And this outlines how sensitivity training merged with the Delphi method and is now being weaponized through cybernetic algorithms. So this kind of manipulates our perception of what we think we think. So that's, really how these siloed different platforms are operating. But when you have holons, it's all going to be interoperable. So you can kind of take whatever your avatar is, your digital twin, and operate across all platforms. And so it's even more interoperable than what we have today. And they keep saying it's decentralized. And they're talking about blockchain technology, and one of their buzzwords is transparent. The problem with transparency is there is no privacy. So that is actually centralized just by default. It has to be. They keep saying digital sovereignty, which it sounds like an oxymoron to me. I know there are people who are really working on truly private technologies. I hope they will accomplish that. But some of those kind of technologies have been hacked already. So it's a real problem. But I do see Game B as much more of it's very deceptive. So if I were to use this analogy for those who have a Christian framework, it's kind of like overt Satanism versus Luciferianism. Lucifer is the light bearer, right? He's going to eliminate us with the gnosis. That's kind of how I see Game B. I'm not saying they're all malevolent characters. That's not what I'm trying to imply. But I think that the result, I think they're utopianists, many of them.
Yes.
I really think that this is the ideal, that they're just so much smarter than all of us. It's scientific socialism, essentially.
That's an interesting way to put it. It sounds, as you're talking, like these different movements and theories would almost compete with each other. And as I was reading your article, it was helping me to sort of diagram it out almost like a Venn diagram to see where they overlap. So maybe we can put that up on the screen and just talk a little bit about how they come at it from a different perspective, but there are overlaps in the way they approach it.
Yes. So I feel like it's very much dialectical, right? So we see this in American politics, but I think we see it in a lot of Western politics in general. Where we've got the left and the right, and when the left is in power, we've got the right, kind of resisting and pushing back, and then the pendulum swings, right? But what really happens is it's a dialectical churn. It's churning the spiral toward the omega point, right? The omega point was a concept by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, his vision of the noosphere. And that's essentially what is being created through these technologies. Game B calls it collective intelligence, which is very reminiscent of the noosphere. And in fact, when they talk about some of these technologies, Game B actually says we're going to inhabit the noosphere.
Wow.
So they're kind of overt about it. But any kind of global technocracy would achieve the world brain, the noosphere. So we've got these, to me, it is dialectical. We've got the dark Enlightenment, which is, again, this autocratic, run like a company where we have a CEO dictator, and it's all done through efficiency. So it's very much overt technocracy. And then you've got it kind of, like I said, I think people are really not pleased with this, and especially in the United States, a lot of people are more familiar with these concepts now, and they're pretty horrified by it. So it pushes them into the embrace of Divine Mother, which I see Game B as much more of the, meeting the archetype of Divine Mother. A lot of this Game B is very invested in Gaia religion. There's something called bee labs, which they say is great for proto bees. But B Labs has B corporations, and B corporations is not a small thing. There are 6,000 of them currently. And there are names like Patagonia and Ben and Jerry's. Ben and Jerry's, who says they're not an ice cream company, they're an activism organization that just happens to sell ice cream.
Wow.
So their focus is doing all these activism videos and essentially, influence operations to brainwash us into why we need to save the planet with these green energy policies. And Game B is very much aligned with that. In fact, many members of Game B are members of Club Rome. Like Zach Stein was inducted last year, Nora Bateson, who is the daughter of Gregory Bateson. They very much talk about aligning with kind of the, sustainable development goals. And that's the B Labs actually has an SDG adapter. So you can get, your scores, your ESG scores through this. So that's how I see it. And I see them kind of feeding each other. But yes, they're taking very different approaches. There's overlap also with the Theobros. Obviously, the Dark Enlightenment, there's a lot of overlap with the Theobros through the Trump administration, through people like J.D. Vance. But there's also Jordan Hall just converted to Christianity last year. And he did speeches at Prospera through the Startup Societies Foundation. He did one 4 years ago talking about Game B network states. And then he did one recently talking about, again, similar Game B network states. And he talked about this concept of liturgy and using liturgy. He didn't use the term communitarianism, but that was essentially what he was suggesting, that we should use this concept of liturgy to build this community, to build these communitarian network states. And communitarianism is a third way politics concept. It was brought to the United States under Bush through the label compassionate conservatism. But the UN in the 1980s talked about it as being a third way. But it is this balance between, the group and the individual, and we're merging the two in a dialectical synthesis. And third way politics, in my article on the technological age of Aquarius, which is very much what I see Game B as being, right, is now we're just using technology to create the collective intelligence. So it's a technological age of Aquarius, third way dream, or digital dystopia is what I called it. But I talk about the third way politics, and how what I see happening right now is that they're using third way politics to usher in the technocracy. So third way is a Fabian socialist concept. Anthony Giddens wrote a book on third way, and he talks about the radical center. And what did Elon Musk talk about with his American Party? We need to collect the 80% center. But what he very explicitly says in his book, Anthony Giddens, is that it's a radical center is always left of center. So this is not like a moderate politics. This is always left of center. And it's radical. This is not moderate. This is not stepping outside the dialectic. What they're trying to do is concentrate these people who are frustrated with the two-party duopoly, the two-party illusion, uniparty, whatever label you want to give it. And I'm not saying there aren't flaws. There absolutely are. George Washington, the first president of the United States, or at least the first, identified president of the United States. There's definitely, theories there were before, but he said that he warned us against this two-party system. He said it would be a loophole for foreign entanglements and for domestic corruption. And I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what he said. And he didn't use the term Hegelian dialectics, but that's what he was alluding to. And we very much see that today. However, they're preying on people who recognize that and understand the problems that therein lie, in order to steer them towards this movement of independence, who are using this radical center to usher in a technocracy. So that is kind of, there's lots of overlap. And then, of course, the network states is definitely, because we've got Game B, we've got the Civium project, which is what Jordan Hall calls it. And that's a huge component of creating proto-bees, the early game bees. And it's really no different than the 15-minute cities. I did another article, it was called The Path to Mass Surveillance. And I outlined all the different types of 15-minute cities. So we have all these different names. We've got the civium, which is game B. We've got these like GovCorp, SovCorp, Dark Enlightenment. We've got the C40 cities, which is the UN. That's the UN green energy, right? Where the central node is Ukraine. That's the central hub for the AI World Society that they're building for the centennial of the UN in 2045. Interestingly enough, Jim Rutt says that the early game B will emerge in 2045. When is the singularity nearer, according to Kurzweil? 2045.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting but then what do we have from Trump? We've got the freedom cities. And doesn't that sound amazing? Who doesn't want to live in a freedom city? I want to live in a freedom city. But it's the same thing. It's the same cities. And so they just rebrand and they just cater. It's like you've got a buffet of ice cream that's all made with poisonous chemicals, but they're going to give you, pretty colors and nice smelling flavors. And, so you can eat your poison. Pick your poison, your flavor.
I was going to ask you, how far along are we to living in that world? But it sounds like, honestly, we already are living in that world. And we don't really get to opt in or out of it. And it's being built around us. So we're not fully baked, but we're in the process. Is that correct? Like, this is not some far off future fantasy.
It's not, but I don't actually think we're already there. I don't think we're in their final vision of what they'd like us to be, immersed. Are they building it? And are we in some ways already? Yes. In some ways, we're glued to our smartphones. We are, fed, through these algorithms, these cybernetic feedback loops through the algorithms. So we're programmed, we're conditioned, we're data mined, and then it's a cycle back and forth through the social media and even through just searches online and even through just what your phone watches, and it's not just your phone. I mean, many people have Alexa and, all these various, I don't know, whatever the other versions of them are, but, they have all those types of technologies installed. And many people have, their TVs, smart TVs. So through all of these things, yes, we're very much being controlled, conditioned, programmed, and data mined. But we're not quite in like a tokenized economy and a tokenized society. It's not just the economy. They want tokenized healthcare. They want tokenized everything, like art, everything. So we're not quite there yet. And they're building the infrastructure for that through, Game B has their variation of it. The Freedom Cities has their variation of it. It's called, in Spanish, it's called ZEDs. So it's the, zoned economic development zones, but zones for economic development. But there's, the UN calls them like special economic development zones, or something like that. And they have a different term for it, but it's essentially what Prospera is. It's essentially what Praxis, right? Peter Thiel invested in Praxis in Greenland, and that's essentially what that is. It's what Bitcoin nations are. So there's so many different versions of these. It's this DAO that Game B has. And so they are already building it, but not everybody is in it already. But these are these like siloed kind of communities. But the agenda is to dissolve the nation state in favor of these types of cybernetic types of city states.
Yeah.
I don't think we're there yet.
We're not quite there yet, but it also sounds like if you're waking up, becoming conscious to what this is, reading work like yours, what do you do to get out of it? I mean, I think a lot of people think in a sort of binary, okay, if I can't live in the United States because this is happening, where can I go? But again, it's a global net that's being cast across the world. So there's not really another country that you can fly to that's going to be better than this. Are there places within the country that you can go, or is that just even the wrong way of thinking about it? Is there another higher way to resist this or to break the spell?
I think, and I don't think that there's like, I don't have like a smoking gun, like here's the solution, is the one thing. And I know that's what everybody wants. And unfortunately, the problem is quite complex and nuanced. So the solution is going to be as well. And I think the solution is very multi-layered and very multifaceted. But I do think there are solutions. And, I end this article talking about cognitive sovereignty. And I really think that sounds so simple and it sounds very abstract, but I think that's a huge bulwark, quite honestly. And it's part of why a lot of people say, well, you keep pointing out the problem. What's the solution, right? But I think the first step is for us to be aware that there is even a threat. Yeah. Right? That there's a threat to the free will of humanity, which I really think is what is imminent. That is, what I aim to be, any part of trying to preserve. I don't claim I'm going to preserve it, but I want to be a part of it, at least helping people recognize that it's in danger. And that is actually quite powerful because you cannot defeat an enemy that you don't know exists, yeah. Right? You have to identify the threat. And so this technocracy is a threat to the free will of humanity. So I think our cognitive sovereignty is what they want to take away. That is part of what they're trying to achieve with creating a noosphere, with this whole, uploading our consciousness to the cloud. That is what they're trying to take away, is the free will, right? You all know what Harari says, that that's a thing of the past. We don't have free will, but he wants to upload our consciousness to the cloud. That's the thing that he just claimed we don't have. Most scientists don't even, IONS has been working for decades trying to figure out what is even consciousness, and they still don't really understand it. But somehow they think they're going to harness it and control it and create a collective variation of it, or some sentient artificial variation of it, which I don't think they ever will achieve, but I think they will try and convince us that they have. And some have already tried convincing us that it actually already exists. So cognitive sovereignty, I think, is tremendously powerful. And that is something that should absolutely be protected. We are being bombarded and brainwashed and programmed. And they're using the data mining in order to do that. That's part of the whole policy of technocracy, right? The data mining is to control us. And Technocracy Inc., actually in their Technocrat magazine in 1937, said the definition of technocracy is social engineering. Mm-hmm. And so I put those quotes and the link to the Wayback Machine on that in several of my articles. But it's really important for people to understand. They have to socially engineer us. They have to brainwash us in order for this to work. And Game B talks about that. They say that we're going to have to, there's a clip from when they're talking about the initiation to Game B film. And I think it was Jeff Gomez who says that he's working on a Disney project. He says, we're going to Trojan horse Game B through the Disney projects. He's like, that's going to be my mission. Every project, just Trojan horse Game B. So they're basically admitting it. Daniel Schachtenberger says that we basically have to kind of socially engineer because people are so stuck in Game A that they can't really understand Game B. So we just have to socially engineer the masses into it. So all that to say, I think cognitive sovereignty is a huge part of it. I think that part of cognitive sovereignty is to instill that in the youth. So, for parents to really take the reins on their children's education. They know whatever that looks like. It's not my decision to tell you how to educate your child. But I think that they are really trying to take complete control so that we can have global citizens. That's Robert Mueller's whole world core curriculum, which is predicated on Alice Bailey's education in the New Age. And that's how we got the world core curriculum, or as Charlotte Elizabeth likes to call it, communist core. I think that's probably more apt. But that's the whole plan, is to create global citizens that are a cog in the technocratic machine. So I think that's a huge part of it. Instill the values that are important to you in your children, and then take, local power. So, and that'll look very different for different people because we all have unique gifts, strengths, and talents and passions, right? Let those be the guide. So we saw in 2020 that the moms were seeing what their kids were being taught on the Zoom, and they were horrified. And, they started running for school board and getting involved in the education system. That was great. They were trying to take some, power over what it is their children were learning. So if that speaks to you, definitely. And at the local level, you have get the tech ed out of the schools. That's a huge part of this. Mm-hmm. That maybe farming is something you're passionate about. And right now, with all the climate smart commodity projects they're trying to implement, this is, where they're tracking your greenhouse gas emissions and tied to carbon credits, which is What did Technocracy talk about? Technocracy Inc. It was energy credits. It's the same thing. They just rebrand, rename it. What were the NACs all about? The natural asset companies. This is commodifying the air we breathe, the water we drink, every natural resource possible. Even, what was it? Photosynthesis they wanted to commodify. So, if that's something you're passionate about and you have some resources and skills in that area, that's something you can get together with other local farmers and, and get involved in local politics to get the climate smart commodity initiatives out of your area.
Mm-hmm.
These are just some examples that there are endless ways people can do it. They can, share information. Like, most people don't even know that. I was shocked to find out a lot of people have never even heard of Technocracy. They don't know what it is.
Yeah.
Again, you can't, defeat a threat you don't know exists. So there are many different ways. I don't think it's a monolith, and I don't think there's a one, solution. But I also think that so many people in the United States, particularly, are not even familiar with the Constitution, and it's not a perfect document. It was created by humans. Obviously, it's flawed. Anything humans design will inherently be flawed. But I think the Declaration of Independence is so unique in that it is the only document in the world that has codified in writing that we were endowed with inalienable rights from our creator.
Yes.
And that's the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that is what the Bill of Rights is predicated on. It's predicated on those philosophical premises. And I think that's really important for people to get in touch with and defend. Yes. Defend that notion of us being, beings that are endowed with inalienable rights from our creator. That means that we are not God. That means that we do not co-create with God. That's the whole premise here, right? We're going to self-apotheosis. So somehow we're going to co-create this new, I call it a technological immanentization of the eschaton. They want to create a simulacra of, heaven here on earth. And that's why have to create technoplastic beings in order to do it, because that is not the natural course of events. Unfortunately, we are mortal. So, yeah.
Fortunately.
Yeah. Yeah. Fortunately, however you look at it, but
exactly.
That's the reality of our circumstances.
It is. And as much as people try and redefine those concepts and make us think that they're not true or they can be superseded, I think what you've just said is so important. And going back to the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, read them, even if you find one and only one spark in it that you hold dear, recognize that that is exactly the thing that they want to burn to the ground so they can rise from the ashes with some new construct and defend it with your life. I think you've really given people so much to think about, lots of homework for people to go and research all these ideas and concepts and names that you've given us. But I really appreciate it, Courtenay. You've done an amazing job.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I hope it's helpful. I know I can be a bit of a fire hose and it's a lot of information, but it is really, really important. And you don't have to get it all at once, but, start with understanding the concept of technocracy and really just to, familiarize yourself with some of these terms because I think they're very deceptive. Things are being couched as like it's decentralized and, we're going to have all this freedom, but it really, at the end of the day, who's going to be running it? Mm-hmm. I mean, even if it's not a person, who's programming the code? Who's programming these algorithms that are going to be running the show? And that's even if they have the best of intentions, which I don't really trust the tech oligarchs, to be quite honest. But even if they have the best of intentions, this is the ramifications of their good intentions. It looks like could be potentially the road paved to hell. So we need to be cautious about that.
Absolutely right. Well, we would love to have you back to talk more about this and some of your future work. But in the meantime, just remind people how they can find out more about you and more importantly, support your work.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So they can find me at CourtenayTurner.com. I spell my name a little bit differently. So it is pronounced Courtenay, but it is spelled Courtenay. So it's spelled CourtenayTurner.com. And that's where you can find all my podcasts. So whichever one you prefer, whatever platform you prefer, my social media. I have lots of great ways you can support the work I am doing. And then also my Substack would be a great way to support me. It's Courtenay Turner's Substack. and again, Courtenay. And this is where I publish my articles. It is also where all of my podcasts go first. So my paid subscribers get early access, and they also get ad-free access. And I know the ads are not always so pleasant to sit through, but I don't have control over them on the other platforms. But on the Substack, that is where you can sit through ad-free and for the cost of a very fancy latte once a month. I don't even think it's that fancy anymore. I think it's kind of the going rate, unfortunately, with the rise of inflation. But yeah, so.
Wonderful. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us today. And we hope to have you back soon.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And it's been my pleasure. So
thank you, Courtenay. And we're so glad that you joined us today as well. If you found this conversation enlightening, and we certainly hope you did, please share it with someone you know. And come and see us at collapselife.com. You can find our latest articles, you can sign up for our newsletter, and you can learn more about us and what we do. If our work speaks to you in any way, we'd be grateful if you would consider becoming a paid subscriber to Collapse Life. Your show of support is very appreciated given how the algorithms work against us. So every like, every comment, and every subscription fuels us forward. We so look forward to seeing you back here next week. Until then, we just remind you to keep your chin up. It's only collapse. See you soon.